Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Rockefeller Center's Spring Public Program event, The History of Roe and the Implications for Abortion Rights in Post-Dobbs America. My name is Jennifer Lee, and I am co-president of Dartmouth Women in Law and Politics. And on behalf of our organization, I would like to thank the Rockefeller Center for their support in organizing this event. Today, we are thrilled to host reproductive law expert, Professor Mary Ziegler. Professor Ziegler is an expert on the history and politics of reproduction, healthcare, and conservatism in the U.S., and her latest book, Roe, The History of a National Obsession, was published in January of this year. Her book will constitute a central part of our discussion this evening. Before we get started, just a few quick Zoom details. Please ask your questions at any time by using the Q&A button. Asking your questions early will increase the likelihood that they will get answered. To access Zoom's closed captioning feature, navigate to Show Captions. If you don't see that option, look under the More button. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for the evening, Professor Julie Kalish. Professor Kalish teaches public policy courses at Dartmouth, and she has been following the Supreme Court and the abortion issue for a long time, and she herself is also a lawyer. So she will be a fantastic moderator for our event. And with that, I'm happy to turn things over to Professor Kalish.
Hi, and thank you everybody for coming. And thank you, Professor Ziegler, for taking time. I know you have been enormously busy for reasons that I want to mention because it kind of sets some context here for our discussion tonight. The event is it was rescheduled. It was originally supposed to happen in February, but changing the date seems to have changed some context because over the past several days we've had two pretty important rulings come out of a court in Texas as well as a court in Washington that both are affecting access to medication abortion drugs. And so that is probably why at least some of you might be with us this evening because you have questions. We still are going to follow my intended arc for the talk was to sort of start in our context both post-Dobbs and now in the context of these rulings this evening, but also then to transfer into the conversation about the book. And I still want to follow that structure. In large part, I think one, because it is a very good book, and but two, because I think it also helps us to create a certain degree of perspective on the conversation that we're having, and that this is a conversation that has been going on for a very long time. It did not start with Roe, it didn't end with Roe, it didn't start with Dobbs, didn't end with Dobbs, and it's going to continue. So Professor Ziegler, thank you so much for being here. And I was hoping that you could just start with a little bit of context before we get into the two most recent rulings with, it's been 10 months since Roe was overturned. And if you could give just like a little bit of a context of where are we right now in terms of abortion laws across the country?
Yeah, I mean, we're in a period, obviously, of pretty intense uncertainty, especially I'll begin with the rulings because I think that's the elephant in the room. On Friday, there were rulings released by district judges in both Washington state and Texas, essentially telling the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, to do diametrically opposed things when it comes to mifepristone, which is a pill that's used in over half the abortions in the United States today. We just don't know what's going to happen next with this. At the moment, the FDA seems to have essentially said, we're going to just leave the status quo in place because that's the best way we can obey both judges' orders. But it seems sooner or later that this question about access to mifepristone, which would be a national question if this Texas judge's order goes into effect, it would affect people in places like California or New Hampshire and not just in places like Texas. that's going to go to the U.S. Supreme Court sooner rather than later, and we'll have more guidance then. So that's representative too, in the sense that a lot of the action, ironically, has been in the federal courts. When the Supreme Court overruled Roe v. Wade this summer, we were told by the justices essentially that the justices were getting out of the abortion business, that this was going to be something resolved by, the people and voters and state lawmakers and the like. In reality, that hasn't been what we've seen so far. We've already seen a lot of litigation at both the state Supreme Court level, but also at the federal district court level. And that's likely to intensify after this ruling from Texas, really, regardless of what the Supreme Court says about it. We've seen, as I mentioned, a lot of victories for the abortion rights side in popular politics. We've had 6 ballot initiatives that have gone to voters in a variety of states, from kind of what we would think of as red or conservative states like Kentucky and Kansas, all the way to very progressive states like California and Vermont. And the abortion rights side has prevailed in 6 of those 6 ballot initiatives in 2022, which is really striking. We've seen state Supreme Courts weigh in, often, but not always, giving some kind of victory to the abortion rights side. We've seen some defeats as well. And again, victories in surprising places. The South Carolina Supreme Court, for example, stated that state's constitution recognizes an abortion right. In Oklahoma, a much narrower decision, that state Supreme Court said that its state constitution required some life-saving exception for pregnant people. And we've seen relatively little, actually, from state legislators compared to what we thought we were going to see. There's a lot of talk about sweeping bans on travel, even for adults, or efforts to apply penalties extraterritorially. That is to say, if someone from Alabama traveled to New Hampshire and got an abortion, Alabama would try to prosecute that doctor, even if they performed the abortion in New Hampshire. We haven't really seen as much of that as we were expecting. And I think most people's reading of that is that legislators are waiting to sort of let things settle down after the 2022 midterms went the way they did. But that a lot of those things, whether it's travel bans, whether it's eliminating remaining exceptions to abortion, whether it's extending some bans to things that are adjacent to but not directly related to abortion, like in vitro fertilization or emergency contraception, that all of that stuff is still on the table, but that the time horizon we're likely to see those bills has been extended maybe into the next year or two. But the other, I kind of think the general theme has been a kind of reluctance of state lawmakers to move, a real reluctance of Congress to do anything. I mean, House Republicans, who are usually seen to be both, have the largest Republican majority, but also tend to be more to the right on these issues, have said nothing aggressive at all, by contrast to a lot of very ambitious, even unprecedented litigation by the anti-abortion side in the federal courts.
Yeah, I wanted to actually follow up, given what you're saying about the hesitation for legislators to do something on. We have not seen that same level of hesitation at the judicial level.
Yeah.
Speaking of this ruling that just came out, and
no hesitation.
I was hoping that you could mention, it was one of the things that struck me about the ruling out of Texas was the resurrection of the Comstock Act and what the implications of that could be. And I will let you explain what the Comstock Act is too. So
yeah, sure. So the Comstock Act was passed in 1873, and it was originally kind of like an omnibus anti-vice law, right? So Anthony Comstock was a Civil War veteran who was really worried that the youth of America were obsessed with sex and that it was destroying the moral fabric of the country. And so I think his primary concern was what he saw as sort of dirty books or pornographic literature, but he defined that term very broadly. So, he thought the Canterbury Tales were pornographic. He thought most kind of medical school anatomy textbooks were pornographic. So, I mean, his definitions of pornographic were much broader than anything you would think of today. But the Comstock Act, in addition to having prohibitions on mailing obscene literature, also had prohibitions on mailing contraceptives or abortifacient drugs. It was passed in 1873. By the early 20th century, the federal courts, although the Supreme Court never weighed in on this, had begun to narrow their interpretation of the Comstock Act essentially to exempt physicians who were mailing abortion drugs or birth control pills or other birth control devices for bona fide medical uses. So essentially they would say you were only violating the Comstock Act if you were intentionally and knowingly mailing pills for a criminal end rather than for a medical purpose. At the same time, Congress, interestingly, in the 50s, expanded the language of the Comstock Act. So it not only covered drugs intended for things like abortion or contraception, but adapted for those purposes, which if you think about it for a minute, could be really radically broad idea. If you fast forward a little more, Congress repeals the birth control provisions of the Comstock Act, but never repeals the Comstock Act altogether. And then there's a group of folks who gave us SB 8 in Texas. You may have heard of this. This is the famous bounty bill that allows people, literally anyone, to sue doctors or other folks who help people get abortions for at least $10,000 per abortion. The team behind that law noticed that the Comstock Act was still on the books and began experimenting with the argument that not only was it enforceable, but that its plain language should control. That is to say, the fact that courts had not been interpreting it that broadly for a really long time didn't matter. The fact that the legislative history of the Comstock Act maybe didn't support that broad of an interpretation didn't matter. If the text said that, that was all that controlled, and that in effect, the Comstock Act was a national ban on all abortions. And this argument has spread throughout the anti-abortion movement. It was used to threaten Walgreens and CVS and other providers who are thinking of pharmacies who are thinking of seeking certification to distribute abortion pills. It's been used in ordinances in small towns in blue states to open the door to a challenge involving the Comstock Act. And recently it was involved in this Texas case as well. So the reason this is significant is that the goal of the anti-abortion movement has never been the reversal of Roe or each state gets to do its own thing. It's always been probably a constitutional prohibition on abortion nationwide. That doesn't look like it's going to happen right now. The Supreme Court had an opportunity to take up a case like that from Rhode Island recently and turned it down. So the next best solution for the standpoint of the anti-abortion movement is a national statute banning abortion, but that's not going to come out of Congress. So the only way you're going to get to that is essentially reviving a zombie law like Comstock and saying, okay, well, this is, we already have a ban. We don't need anybody to pass a new one. We don't need voters to like it. Here it is. And then you need, of course, courts to interpret the Comstock Act that way. And you need the Justice Department, federal law enforcement, to enforce the Comstock Act. That's obviously a big deal because it means if you're in a state like New Hampshire where abortion is legal, or California or New York or whatever, even if you are electing people who support access to abortion, even if you have a state constitutional provision like California does protecting abortion and other forms of reproductive freedom, you may have a federal law that's trumping all of that. Of course, the Comstock Act could be repealed, right? And I expect to see if the Supreme Court does go down that road, we're going to start to have serious conversations in Congress about repealing the Comstock Act, which honestly are, 50 years or so overdue, but we would expect to see more of that. But this is really something to watch because I think it's kind of at the center of current anti-abortion strategies.
And it's actually a great transition to, in my view, to the book, because one of the things that the book is doing is it really is articulating the long-standing dance that has gone on between the anti-abortion movement and the abortion rights movement, and noting how they are in sort of constant conversation with one another, and as they're trying out their arguments. And to give those of you who have not read the book, I hope yet, it's a very readable book too. I just want to plug that too. The book is, what it's doing is it's taking that Roe conversation and it's getting curious about the different ways that we have socially and culturally and politically used Roe as a decision, as a sort of shorthand to talk about a lot of different kinds of issues, and issues of choice, issues about consent, issues of feminism, issues about race and racial equality, science, religious liberty, that sort of thing, as well as the role of the court, as well as the role of our different branches of government, and their sort of respective zones of control. And it's interesting because I have one question I wanted to ask you, sort of back before, and it's seeming like an obvious question right now, but you didn't start writing this book at this particular moment in time. And I'm curious to know why you wanted to take up this conversation in this way at this particular time.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I was writing the book, it was pretty clear that Roe was going to get overturned. And one of the things that kept striking me was how emotionally moved a lot of people were by the thought of Roe, whether that was people who felt kind of bereft and insulted that Roe was going to be overturned, or people who were really delighted that Roe was going to be overturned. And one of the reasons this was striking to me is that I'm a lawyer and a law professor, right? So Roe wasn't the law at that point. Roe had already been partially overturned by this 1992 decision called Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And when anybody actually read Roe, they tended to think Roe was not the world's most well-reasoned decision. And so there was this divergence between the Roe people had in their hearts, right? Like when we people talking about Roe, they didn't mean the Supreme Court's decision in 1973. And so that was sort of what interested me. I wanted to know why it was at this moment that we were going to be losing Roe, the 73 decision, that this other Roe had this hold on us, and why that was. And I because I've been writing about the history of the abortion debate for a long time, I'd always been curious about that. And that was what motivated me to write the book. And I think generally I'm also interested in how social movements, just try to change the society with respect to abortion too. But I also was well aware from this book and the book I wrote right before this, that whenever we're talking about abortion, I think it's easy to imagine abortion as a siloed issue. I do a lot of panels on this. I do a lot of media on this, and I can't tell you the number of times where everyone who's talking or invited to speak is either, is someone who can get pregnant. Like there are no cis men anywhere to be seen. And the sort of messaging is, this is one of the most important political issues of our time. Yes, this is an issue that's swinging elections one way or another. Yes, but this is also sort of an issue that doesn't affect everybody, right? And as a historian, I was noticing more and more that the fight to get rid of Roe, both 73 Roe and the kind of broader Roe we've all imagined, was changing lots of other things. It was changing the way laws on racial justice worked. It was changing the way access to the vote worked. It was changing the way campaign finance rules worked. And so I also wanted to write about how all of these things are interconnected, so that there wasn't this misconception that essentially, this is an issue for folks who can be, want to be, or potentially will be pregnant, and that everybody else can kind of, they may care about it, but it's ultimately not going to affect them personally. I think that if you understand the history that's gone into the reversal of Roe and debates even about what Roe means, you see that that's wrong, right? And you see that the stakes are bigger. And I'm not diminishing at all what this has meant for people who can get pregnant, because that's been already has been pretty shocking in terms of what we've seen. But the effects, I think, for everybody else are pretty pronounced in ways that it's easy to miss.
Yeah, and actually, I'm going to sort of integrate a question that has already come up in the Q&A, which reminds me to encourage you all to be dropping your questions in the Q&A, because I will do something like this, where I will integrate a question to the talk. The question is that it says, it appears that Republicans in your former state of Florida, I like the pointed nature of that, are moving towards passing a 6-week ban. Given public opinion, doesn't this make it more likely that Governor DeSantis, if he's the Republican nominee for president, will lose votes? Is he only thinking of Republican primary voters? And why I kind of wanted to integrate this is here is because I wanted to integrate that into a question of in terms of what you're talking about in the way Roe has come to stand in for a lot of different conversations, a lot of different values. Has Roe actually been overturned? If you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, I like the symbolic Roe that we all believe in, maybe not. I mean, that Roe hasn't gone anywhere. I mean, people still have rallies, like Joe Biden still talks about codifying Roe. And it's weird because whenever anyone says that, you never know what they're talking about. I mean, I had the most sort of surreal moment this way, I remember, during the 2020 presidential campaign, because Mike Pence had said, Biden supports abortion after birth. And a reporter called me and said, is that true? And I said, well, why is he saying that? And I said, because he supports Roe. And I said, well, they don't mean the same thing by Roe. This is the problem. But yeah, whether Roe is overturned or not is hard to say. The Ron DeSantis point is really interesting because I think it speaks to the dilemma the Republican Party faces now, which is that on the one hand, you have a group of primary voters, and I think this is really clear in the history, who are in this for fetal personhood, right? And expect the GOP to do as much as possible to move the debate in that direction. And then you have a large swath of voters. There's only about, I think, depending on the poll you read, between 13 and 20% of Americans who would want the equivalent of a personhood ban, because that would mean more or less in no exceptions abortion ban. Everyone else, again, in the ballpark of, 70 to 80% of people, 85 even percent of people want abortion to be either legal with no restrictions or legal with restrictions. And so you have a dilemma for Republicans who, on the one hand, may not make it out of a primary without endorsing pretty sweeping abortion restrictions, and who may not make it out of a general if they do. So I think what Governor DeSantis ostensibly did, he had been kicking the can down the road on abortion. I think he realized that he needed to worry about primary voters first, given his track record or lack thereof on abortion, and then hope that voters prioritize other issues. But that's been a risky gamble, at least so far as we've seen in 2022.
Yeah. And then I'm going to tie in these other two questions that just came in, because they get into this issue, this conversation that I wanted to dive into a little bit more about the way the chapters are, in fact, looking at how issues about race and equality, issues about feminism and personhood, the two questions that came in are, what do the implications of overturning Roe have to do with some of these other areas? Like, do they play out in those other areas? And this other question said, how do you anticipate Dobbs, which is like overturning Roe, impacts the legal personhood of girls and women?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, so I mean, Dobbs said almost nothing about fetal personhood, and that was really interesting, because did I expect the majority to do that? No. Did I expect Clarence Thomas to talk about fetal personhood? Yeah, totally. I mean, Clarence Thomas is usually the person who mainstreams the arguments people find to be too extreme the fastest. And excuse me, the fact that he didn't was really interesting and revealing. I think the court did raise lots of questions about whether other substantive due process rights would be under fire, like rights to same-sex marriage, rights to intimacy, especially for queer folks, but also other people as well, rights to contraception. The majority, of course, said that wasn't what it was doing, but the majority's methodology would definitely call all of those other rights into question. I think the fetal personhood project is one that is probably going to take longer, but it's one that I think the anti-abortion movement is probably in it for the long haul anyway. So I don't think that we need to think as much about, I mean, the fact that the court in Dobbs did not telegraph that that was a direction it was interested in going doesn't tell us necessarily that that isn't something that's going to happen moving forward. So I think beyond that, I mean, really the first kind of clear sign or conversation we've seen about personhood was actually in this case in mifepristone that just came out of Texas, where there was a really strong reference to fetal personhood. So whether courts go that road, I think, will depend on how quickly it's normalized, and whether the anti-abortion movement's able to leverage some of the tools that's already sort of seated in other laws, whether that's fetal homicide laws, wrongful death laws, areas where anti-abortion activists have been pushing for recognition of a fetus or unborn child as a rights-holding person in non-abortion contexts, essentially to say we already think of this entity as a rights holder, so surely it must have constitutional rights too. I'm happy to talk about, the constitutional arguments for and against fetal personhood, which are not, I mean, there are problems, as you would say, with constitutional arguments for fetal personhood, but I don't think that they're off the table in the long term as a political or social movement matter.
Yeah, and I think that the most recent Texas opinion really made that clear, that that's going to be part of the conversation. I was hoping, actually, if you could, since we got the question sort of focused on race and equality, I was wondering maybe if you could describe what you were talking about in that race and equality chapter about the way the issue of Roe really started to intersect with these other kinds of conversations. And then after describing that, kind of maybe come back to this question of like, so if you take the abortion conversation out of that, like, does overturning Roe take the abortion conversation out of that? Do we have an end to that story, or do we still have an ongoing story there?
Yeah, I mean, so there were always intersections between questions of racial justice and Roe, and really abortion generally, because it is as early as the 1960s, abortion-related mortality was infinitely higher for people of color than it was for other people, right? So at the same time that pregnancy and abortion were becoming safer for primarily white women and other pregnant people in cities like New York, it was actually, abortion was becoming more deadly for people of color because they didn't have access to this kind of safe medical care. So those issues were always there, but race wasn't usually overtly discussed. And if it was discussed really by both abortion rights supporters and abortion opponents in ways we would find kind of creepy and inappropriate now. Usually debates about, whose position would better reduce the number of people on welfare rolls, where sort of everyone was speaking in ways we would now recognize as eugenic. I think when you started to see more overt conversations about the relationship between abortion access and reproductive justice was in more recent decades. Some of that was because the reproductive justice movement mobilized and began to have more of an impact on mainstream discourse about abortion, reproductive health, and rights. This was especially the case after 2004, when reproductive justice organizers had enough impact on a national abortion rights march that you began to see larger groups like Planned Parenthood describe reproductive justice, which, just to be clear, argues that there's more necessary than just constitutional rights to make decisions about something like abortion or sterilization or contraception, but rather that there are a lot of people, but especially people of color, who need support from the government to raise the children they want to have in safe and healthy environments, that issues like access to the ballot or racial justice are reproductive issues too. And that argument had been, I think, formulated at various points in time by people of color, but pushed much more vigorously in the 90s, and then kind of caught on in mainstream discourse in the 2000s. This was also a point at which it was becoming really abundantly clear that the abortion rate in communities of color was much higher than it was in the white community. So particularly among Black pregnant people, but also among Latinx pregnant people as well. At the same time, you began to see anti-abortion groups trying to develop a response to this, to the kind of emergence of reproductive justice organizing, especially because this was a time when anti-abortion groups were realizing that they had been branded as kind of anti-woman, as extremist, as sometimes aligned with white supremacist or separatist movements, especially because some of the folks in the movement who had mounted attacks on or murders of abortion providers did have those kinds of extremist links. And so you began to see the anti-abortion movement talking in different ways about race as well, essentially saying, there's this dark history within the family planning movement, and to a lesser extent the abortion rights movement, of embracing things like eugenics. And so the anti-abortion movement wanted to say, that is true in the present as well. And the real problem with these abortion rate disparities, is that there's intentional racism by entities like Planned Parenthood that are actually targeting people of color. The response generally of the abortion rights movement, not the reproductive justice movement, the sort of generic abortion rights movement, was to say essentially that people of color benefited from access to family planning and abortion. But there was this sort of awkward silence that the reproductive justice movement really needed to fill, which was essentially, well, why is it that people of color are having abortions at higher rates? It's not just because they love abortion and they think abortion is awesome. It's because there's some failing going on there, that there are other forms of justice that people are being denied that are leading them to have, at least sometimes have abortions when they may not want to, right? Sometimes they're having abortions because they want to. Sometimes they're having abortions because they don't feel that they're in a position where they can raise a child in a world that is fair to that child. And so I think there was an opportunity that reproductive justice organizers are still, I think, just beginning to take, to have a conversation about what really racial justice and abortion mean together. And that conversation was just beginning, I think, in the mid-2000s, and it's accelerated recently, and it's intensified by the fact that there's been a kind of regional reorientation of the abortion debate. If you go into the pre-Roe era, the strong hold of the anti-abortion movement was really the Northeast, right? It was states like Massachusetts, it was the mid-Atlantic, it was places like Pennsylvania. And those were not places that were as known for, a dark history of racial segregation and racial violence as much as the American South. Starting in the 80s and 90s, the anti-abortion movement stronghold became the South and to a lesser extent the Midwest. And so you're starting to see even more pressing questions about the intersection of racial justice and abortion now, because the states that have the most sweeping abortion bans are also the states that incarcerate people at the highest rates, that have the highest rates of maternal mortality, period, but especially for people of color. So I think you're seeing people press these questions even more. And removing Roe from the equation, if anything, I think is just brought into clearer relief how much you have to talk about racial justice when you talk about these issues.
And we've got a question that actually intersects so well with what you were just leaving off with, which is, when did the anti-abortion movement become linked to the evangelical right in politics?
Yeah, that's interesting too. So it was the late 70s, early 80s. So up until that point, it wasn't necessarily the case that evangelicals were comfortable with abortion. Individual evangelicals and even evangelical entities were not. But generally, the position of both Southern and Northern evangelical entities, like the Northern Association of Evangelicals or the Southern Baptist, was sort of what, like a middle ground. The 60s and 70s were essentially opposed, meaning no restrictions on abortion. But we think that certain exceptions for abortion are necessary, like in cases of rape or incest. And part of this was just substantively what people in evangelical communities thought. And some of it was that people in those communities had a deep discomfort with Catholicism, and they perceived the anti-abortion movement to be a Catholic movement. That began to change over the course of the 70s, in part because religious right leaders, as the religious right mobilized, you began to see the formation of organizations like Christian Voice and the Moral Majority, had a problem with lots of other things beyond abortion, whether that was the mobilization of the early gay and lesbian rights movement, or the advent of no-fault divorce, or just the changing roles of cisgender women in the home. But it was hard to see what anyone could do about any of that, right? It was not easy to just flip a switch and say, okay, now there's no more gay and lesbian rights movement, and now, people are going to go back to fault divorce, and all of a sudden, cis women are going to discover that they just want to stay home and bake cookies. Like there was nothing anybody could do about that. But Roe and abortion became a symbol of everything else that evangelicals were uncomfortable with. It could symbolize or stand in for all of these other social changes. And just as important, it was something that people could do something about, right? In theory, if you had the right people on the Supreme Court, or if you had a constitutional amendment, you could put an end to Roe. And so there was a big resurgence, or I guess kind of bubbling up for the first time, of interest in the abortion issue in the evangelical right. The Southern Baptist Convention, for example, for the first time in 1980, stakes out a strong anti-abortion position with no exceptions. You begin to see Northern evangelicals doing the same thing. And then over the course of the 1980s, evangelicals flood into the anti-abortion movement. And by the 1990s and 2000s, it's often conservative Christian multi-issue organizations like the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is the group that was actually bringing this suit in Texas, that are playing as central a role in the movement as the sort of classic single issue anti-abortion organizations that had been central before. And of course, groups like ADF are evangelical first, right? I mean, they see their mission as a religious one, and they tie abortion to other issues that are compelling to conservative evangelicals, whether that's a particular view of religious freedom or opposition to same-sex marriage or the like.
Yeah, we have a question sort of following up on this, wondering about Ronald Reagan.
Mm-hmm.
And the question explicitly says, wasn't the politicization of evangelicals a deliberate strategy started by Reagan? Are those, like the way you're talking about it, it seems a little bit more organic, but do those two things intersect?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there were I think, I mean, there were a lot of stakeholders who had an investment in evangelicals coming into the Republican Party. So, I mean, I've written on this too. Reagan and particularly leaders of what we now call the New Right, like Paul Weyrich and Richard Viguerie, believed that the Republican Party could build an unassailable majority if Reagan could win over conservative Catholics and evangelicals who had been voting Democratic, either because of habit or because of economic reasons. At the same time, I think you had a group of kind of emerging televangelists who wanted to make a political impression, who were ready and willing to be, I guess, co-opted, if you will. It was not, they were not being manipulated. They were happy to go along with this. And I think there was also a genuine discomfort with abortion and gender that was there for Reagan to exploit. It was not as if evangelicals were, had firm convictions about the need to keep abortion safe and legal, and Reagan brainwashed them. They had deep discomfort with all of these changes involving sexuality and gender that were taking place across the national landscape, and Reagan did a good job of making abortion the boogeyman for all of those changes. So I think there were opportunities there that Reagan and religious right leaders exploited that were real opportunities, but I also do think there was a lot of kind of successful political strategy to make those opportunities go anywhere.
This is like a personal, like, indulging myself question. One of the ways that you structure the book is that you, in each one of these chapters, you highlight a person or two people and use their stories, use their a lot of times very personal stories as kind of a vehicle to take you through the chapter. And I was wondering, do you have a favorite character or character who's like really resonating with you right now?
I mean, it kind of depends on what you mean by favorite, right? Because I mean, clearly there are characters in the book, for those of you who haven't read it, who are like not necessarily people like you would want to hang out, or I would want to hang out with anyway, right? So there are not everyone is a hero, right? I mean, there are people I think I find. I mean, the people I found the most interesting, I mean, I really admire some of the people who are in the book, who I agree with. The people I found sort of the most complicated and difficult to understand. There was an anti-abortion activist named Victor Rosenblum, who was very progressive and very pro, the judiciary recognizing rights for the oppressed. And it was interesting to me to watch him try to reconcile his beliefs about justice in the court with his work on abortion. And even the experience of his own family. I mean, I talked to a lot of his children, and there were some personal stories about abortion in that family. I ultimately decided not even to include because they were so personal. But that was a really moving story. I found also on the anti-abortion side, Mark Lee Dixon, who's the gentleman who's behind these sanctuary cities for the unborn, as they're called, laws, and SB 8 and the Comstock extra. I mean, he's super important. And his personal story, sort of how he, I mean, really identifies with the fetus, right? And has had a lot of issues in his own life that were kind of sad and hard to listen to. So hearing someone like that, with whom I don't agree, reason as to how he got to where he was really interesting. So I think I had characters I liked and admired, and then I had characters who I had a hard time understanding in ways that I found interesting. And I often write about people I don't agree with and find puzzling. I mean, the book I'm writing now is just about the movement for fetal personhood and how it's trying to change what we mean by equality. And so almost everybody I'm writing about now are people I don't necessarily agree with, but I think sometimes that's something that works for me intellectually, is to sort of approach things I find unsettling or troubling and study them instead of the people I find instinctually to be correct. I think sometimes it's almost, when I do that, it's almost sort of when you're reading and your brain just fills in the missing words where you're like, oh yeah, of course, yes, absolutely, that should be that way. And I don't see the kind of the problems. I don't see the missing links. I don't see the historical narrative, where if it's something I find to be disturbing, I sometimes am actually more perceptive, probably to my detriment in terms of writing things that are depressing. So
actually, again, I love when people throw their questions in all the way through, because then I can weave them in along these same lines of things that seem puzzling, things that seem kind of contradictory. We got a question that says, this seems like such a basic question, but I can't understand why anti-abortion activists are not more supportive of child-friendly policies. Do you understand why they seem to live or die on the abortion question, but then don't pursue policies like family leave or universal health care or daycare or early education?
Yeah, I mean, I think so the answer to this question is complicated, right? On the one hand, I would say there are people in the anti-abortion movement who are more supporting child-friendly policies than they did before Dobbs. And so there was a push, for example, to get the Federal Pregnant Workers Fairness Act passed, which is legislation that requires employers to actually affirmatively accommodate pregnant workers. And that was actually received some support from the anti-abortion movement. One of the chief lobbyists for that was actually the US Conference of Catholic Bishops. There's an anti-abortion group called Americans United for Life that wants to make birth free. The ongoing theme of everything I just said is that there's a lot of interest in making it easier for people who are pregnant to be pregnant, or for fetuses while they're in the womb. There's very little to nothing on family-friendly policies after birth has happened. And so there's been a little movement in this direction, but mostly, again, in policies surrounding pregnancy. The rest of the question is really interesting. This is something I'm writing about in the book about personhood, which is essentially, why is it that our version of fetal personhood has landed so decisively on incarcerating people, right? If you look at what do people mean by personhood, they generally mean that some people, at least doctors, probably people helping other people having abortions, and maybe even pregnant people themselves, need to go to prison for a very, very long time for having abortions. And that's what equality for the fetal person means. That's not in any way inevitable, right? There are other nations that have regimes that recognize that fetal life has some kind of constitutional value, that don't criminalize abortion at all, or that simultaneously recognize constitutional liberty for pregnant people. So the fact that we've ended up where we are is kind of, I think, a function more of how our anti-abortion debate has evolved. And I mean, it's a long story, but some of the relevant features of it are that the anti-abortion movement was aligned with the Republican Party, and aligned with the Republican Party at a time that Ronald Reagan was really intensifying, the war on drugs, the war on crime, building lots of private prisons, passing laws that created mandatory minimum sentences, and leading to, I think, a massive spike in the percentage of Americans, especially Americans of color, but all Americans who are incarcerated, and presenting that as a vindication of victims' rights. Reagan was tapping into a lot of victims' rights movements that were coming into being in the 80s, whether that was Mothers Against Drunk Driving or groups representing survivors of sexual assault. And the anti-abortion movement was tapping into Reagan's rhetoric. Reagan was essentially saying the way you vindicate victims' rights is not by actually helping victims, it's by punishing people who wrong victims. And anti-abortion groups were tapping into the same rhetoric and saying the way you vindicate the rights of the unborn child is not by helping the pregnant person, or showing you value life in some other way, like continuing to support that life after pregnancy or even during pregnancy. It's by punishing the people who wrong the fetal person, right? So that you see this big upsurge in fetal homicide laws, in prosecutions of folks who take drugs during pregnancy, wrongful death laws, generally ways where you're sort of trying to get back at the person who wronged the fetal victim. Their constitutional arguments go in that direction too. And that's still very much where the movement is. I mean, as you know, in New Hampshire, there's an effort to remove criminal and civil penalties from your bill, right? Your ban on abortion after viability. And there's huge pushback from the anti-abortion movement, because the idea that you would have fetal protection that does not lead to someone going to jail or paying a lot of money, to them, that just doesn't mean anything. And that was not historically inevitable. And I think it's pretty depressing that we landed there. But that in a word, I think, is one of the reasons why you see less of a focus on what would be kind of ways of expressing that you value life in the womb by treating the people who are pregnant well, and treating that life as having value after pregnancy ends.
I want to transition because we're getting questions obviously about kind of the what's the post-Dobbs path forward for abortion rights. But I kind of want to get there a little bit by there's a quote at the beginning of your book where you say invoking a Supreme Court decision as a touchstone of debate suggests deference to the judiciary, but the free and frequent reinterpretation of opinions like Roe suggests that courts are only one voice in a broader dialogue about rights. The more the justices convince Americans of their partisanship, the more we may consciously untether our ideas about the Constitution and national identity from what the justices say. If belief in the court's impartiality continues to nosedive, the practice of popular constitutionalism may become more openly independent of the court. And I was hoping you could first explain a little bit more what you mean by popular constitutionalism. And then what might that actually look like to untether the court?
Yeah, so popular constitutionalism, generally when you think about, well, who gets to say what the Constitution means, it's the Supreme Court. But then when you stop and think about it, that's not right? Lots of people. So when the Supreme Court overruled Roe, a lot of people were unhappy and they didn't say, oh, of course, it turns out the Constitution never recognized this right. And thanks, Sam Alito, now we understand. People thought, no, the Constitution does in fact recognize this right. And Samuel Alito is just wrong. And that was people in some ways saying, I am an interpreter of the Constitution. You saw pushback from the presidents and the White House. You saw pushback from members of Congress. You saw pushback from state legislators. And you then eventually began to see pushback in ways that were more consequential. So you began to see constitution making happening in a lot of places. So a lot of the ballot initiatives I mentioned earlier were about the meaning of state constitutions, right? So California, Michigan, Kansas, Kentucky, places like that weighing in on what they wanted their state constitutions to say or not say about abortion. State Supreme Courts weighing in on what their state constitutional tradition had to say about abortion. State legislators invoking the Constitution and passing non-constitutional bills about abortion. And so I think what's clear in all of that is that, one, when the Supreme Court issues decisions, it's not doing that in a vacuum, right? The Supreme Court's members were put there in part, in my opinion, as a historian, to overrule Roe. They have rich connections to the conservative legal movement and other right-wing movements, as well as party politics that have taken shape in a certain way. The court generally, when it issues decisions, is in dialogue with movements and politicians that are making arguments, putting pressure on the court, both political and otherwise. And the court is paying attention, I think, to varying degrees, depending on who's on the court, on how other actors are interpreting their own constitutional traditions, whether that's the federal or state constitution. And I think what you're seeing now in a post-Dobbs world is that people are really coming alive to the fact that there are lots of other ways we can invoke the Constitution that don't involve the Supreme Court, especially at the state level. But I think even beyond it too. And sometimes, again, bypassing politicians altogether and going directly to voters and asking them what they want their state constitutional tradition to look like. I think that's especially exciting because our country is so polarized and our partisan divides run so deep. It's sometimes very hard to get a gauge of what voters want the Constitution to mean if you just go based on who they're voting for. Whereas if you can put a question to them directly about, here is a state constitutional right, thumbs up or thumbs down, you get much more surprising and I think revealing results. And so I think that's a popular constitutional practice we're likely to see a lot more of. Again, not in every state, because not every state allows for ballot initiatives, or if they do, not every state allows for voters to initiate that process. But I expect to see a lot more of that in the future.
What happens, this is again, what happens if the US populace does lose faith in the impartiality of the courts?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't think we really know in a way, right? I mean, in the past, we have past precedent where people have just ignored the court, like, for example, in the South with school prayer, the Supreme Court said school prayer is unconstitutional. And a lot of people just said, okay, great, we're going to do it anyway. And you have kind of more dramatic versions of that. It can create, I mean, in a way, often, sometimes there would be threats to the court's power. You would see Congress sometimes proposing bills to strip the court of jurisdiction in certain matters. which is, may or may not be permissible, but seems to be under some circumstances. You would see proposals to change the number of justices on the court, various kinds of court reform proposals, and the court might back off. So one possibility is that you would see more of an urgent conversation about court reform. The darker possibility is just that you could have a crisis of legitimacy such that when we want to call upon the court to resolve an issue, we want people to believe that the court's resolution is fair or just, that people just aren't going to believe that, right? So if you have another kind of election crisis akin to the one we saw in 2020, and the US Supreme Court intervened to try to settle it, you could imagine that if faith in the court as an institution has been eroded past a certain point, that the court would just be unable to play that role. And I think that would be concerning for a number of reasons. But I think there's already been pretty serious damage to the court's legitimacy. And I think the question is just, how much worse things are going to get.
And then again, to sort of like bringing things to real world pragmatic consequences. I mean, what's happening with women's healthcare and healthcare in general in states that have criminalized? And the FDA ruling has vast implications beyond mifepristone and abortion too.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing in a lot of states that have abortion bans that there's a lot of uncertainty about how broadly they apply. So by that, I mean, in particular, what happens if you have a miscarriage or a stillbirth or some other negative pregnancy outcome and you need emergency care? And what we've found so far is that when there is an abortion ban in place, especially one that has serious prison time attached to it, a lot of doctors are not willing to risk their luck, that their actions are going to be justified by exceptions. And so we've seen a lot of people having to travel out of state for emergency care, or having to wait until they're sick enough for doctors to intervene, sometimes, close enough to death, essentially, the doctors feel that their actions will be justified. We've seen some kind of countermeasure by anti-abortion activists or legislators in particular to try to clarify that isn't necessary. But it doesn't tend to be effective when you're asking doctors to, if they're wrong, face, 5 years in prison, 15 years in prison, life in prison without parole. We're seeing the flight of doctors, especially obstetrician gynecologists, from states with abortion bans, in part because they feel that they can't practice in those states. That obviously has pretty serious ramifications for healthcare access for people who can get pregnant in those states generally, because of course those are already states with worse maternal health outcomes. And so if you have a kind of general flight of doctors from those states, and you have a lot of programs, obstetric and gynecological programs, potentially either losing accreditation or developing kind of subpar alternatives to training in situations where people have not just abortions, but miscarriages or stillbirths, that you're seeing kind of spillover effects that way too. And again, I think we've just begun to see how this is going to affect healthcare, because again, I think people in the anti-abortion movement have concerns not just about abortion, but about emergency contraception, about IUDs, about infertility treatments and the like. So I think what we're seeing now is likely just the tip of the iceberg.
And then I think this may be our final question, and I'm going to kind of integrate here a few. I know there are activists out there in our audience right now. One person has asked a question about, different kinds of arguments that we might use. This question specifically references the vaccination analogy of you can't tell me what to do with my own body, bodily integrity kinds of arguments. Earlier, you sort of mentioned movements towards state law. Where do you feel like the sort of activism is going to start playing out?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that's difficult, so there are a lot of really cool and promising arguments, but which argument is going to work is going to depend on where you are, because I think unless we're talking about, we're going to have a serious conversation about Congress repealing the Comstock Act, which, by the way, like, write your senator if you're an activist or you're a member of Congress and say, let's have a bill repealing the Comstock Act, because that would be a great, I mean, it's just sitting there like a loaded gun waiting for someone to use it, and it should be repealed. And if people want to defend it, they should have to explain why they want to criminalize the mailing of any drug adapted for abortion, which is a term, in my view, that could be applied to something like Advil. So that's a good starting point. But other than that, rhetorically, I think you're really going to be having 50 different fights, right? So rhetorically, what would work in a state like California, where we were having conversations about protecting people against reproductive coercion, it was a really robust idea of reproductive justice that voters happily signed off on, is not going to work in a place like Missouri, right, which does not have an, or Tennessee, which doesn't even have a ballot initiative process. And there you're starting to see organizers focus on the cost of enforcing criminal abortion bans, and essentially saying to conservatives who don't want to pay a lot of taxes, do you really want to bankroll the kind of surveillance state it's going to take to uncover who is helping who get an abortion and who is actually having an abortion, because that's going to be expensive. And you see sort of small government, hands off my body, I didn't want you to tell me to get a vaccine messages in places like Kansas, right? So I think what will work will depend on who you are. And as long as the game plan, I think, which has been the game plan so far, is to do what you can do locally and to find voters where they are, the messaging is going to have to depend. It's going to vary from state to state. It's really the politics of the local, I think, with the exception of, the Comstock Act, which I think people need to talk about at the national level too.
Yeah. And actually, because we have another minute, I wanted to follow up on the earlier you had mentioned the Texas vigilante law, and it's sort of dropped off the radar a little bit in terms of public awareness about it. Is that still a live? Are people actually using it, or has it sort of, since the overturning of Roe has been accomplished, has it sort of dropped off a little bit?
It's still there. I mean, what's interesting is that it hasn't been used as much, in part because Texas, where the law was passed, has multiple abortion bans from fertilization that are criminal. And so in a way, it isn't as necessary. It also wasn't as appealing, I think, to anti-abortion activists because they couldn't control who the plaintiffs were. So interestingly, the folks who sponsored Texas's SB 8 have been finding individual plaintiffs to bring wrongful death suits against people who've aided others having abortions. Why are they doing that? In part, I think, because they're trying to set a precedent for the idea that the fetus or unborn child should be treated as a rights-holding person, as opposed to just, the suits should be allowed. I think they want the suits to mean more. They want them to be a building block to a nationwide abortion ban. But I think SB 8 style suits don't seem as necessary when you can have outright bans. And the point of civil suits is often either when you have a progressive prosecutor in a place like Austin who's unwilling to enforce a criminal law, or when you're using that civil suit as a building block for something like fetal personhood down the road.
Which pretty much takes us to the end. Thank you so much for joining us. And I know that this is it's always an awkward thing to end a webinar as everybody just sort of signs off, but thank you everybody so much for joining us. Thank you to Dartmouth Women in Law and Politics, to the Rockefeller Center, and thank you to Professor Ziegler.
Thanks for having me.